If you have listened to this podcast for a long time, then you probably know that Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been a very influential person in my life. That's why, pretty much every year, I think actually every year since I started recording, I will have a recording dedicated to Bonhoeffer on like April 8th or April 9th, pretty much every year. I do that on April 9th because that is the day of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's death in 1945. Now, it might seem like kind of a weird thing to do, to celebrate on the day of somebody's death, but it's actually a very Christian thing to do. See, the way that saints are celebrated, for the most part, in the Christian world, is that we recognize someone on the day of their death, because really what we believe is that it's a day where they are made new, or they receive new life as they are taken to glory to be with God. And so it's a celebration of a life well lived and a celebration unto new life. Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was someone who is very encouraging to me and somebody who I want to celebrate his new life with, because I know that when he got to be in the presence of God, that it was said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And I want Dietrich Bonhoeffer to influence my life. Bonhoeffer was someone who threw off status and he humbled himself to work with people that others didn't want to work with. He was heavily influenced by suffering communities, first with the black community in apartheid United States, and then the Jews in Germany. He helped others at cost to himself, and he embraced integrity no matter what. He spoke up. He was vocal about the evils that were occurring when most other people were silent. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a very special person, and I want to be discipled by him, and so I try to commemorate him every year. Now, I think we could pick a lot of different people who we could commemorate every year, and the church does, right? There are lots and lots of different saints that you can commemorate, and you can't really cover them all. So why did I pick Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Because there are other special people too. Well, coming from a position of nonviolence, Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been especially interesting to me because of my perceived commonality with him on that position. Because since the Ante-Nicene Church, there aren't all that many people who've held to a position of nonviolence. It's more of a minority position. And so I felt kind of a kinship with Bonhoeffer, that he would embrace that ideology just made him more meaningful to me. And facing somebody, a lion like Hitler, as a lamb who was slain, I mean, that's just beautiful in my nonviolent book, right? Back in the day, though, I accepted the narrative that Bonhoeffer had been plotting to kill Hitler. But even after becoming a pacifist, I didn't think that was that big of a deal, that narrative to keep around. As maybe an example of this, if you YouTube like I think his name is Pablo Yoder, right? He's this missionary down in South or Central America, and he talks about how he embraces nonviolence, but his family's been attacked a number of times, and how each time he has to make the conscious decision to be nonviolent, and how one time he had a baseball bat in his house because I guess his kids played baseball or something, and it wasn't intended as a weapon, but when he went to his room to get money that he was being threatened for, he looked at that baseball bat and he's like, "I've got to get that out of the house," right? It's a temptation. It's always possible that you slip and you fail, right, at your standard. So in regard to Bonhoeffer, I mean, who wouldn't understand if Bonhoeffer threw off nonviolence in a moment of desperation and weakness? The story of Bonhoeffer who embraced pacifism, but then in a moment of weakness went to assassinate Hitler, like, that just made sense to me. It didn't seem like that big of a deal. But I've come to learn that that's not really at all what's being argued by a lot of people when they claim that Bonhoeffer embraced violence at the end. What they're arguing is that his embrace of violence, it wasn't weakness in the moment. It was an ideological shift. Bonhoeffer realized how idealistic pacifism was, so he threw it off for the correct ethic, a realist ethic that demanded he engage in violence for the greater good. So how we understand Bonhoeffer's actions at the end of his life, they really matter a whole lot. And did he cling to pacifism? Did he put his pacifism aside in a moment of weakness, recognizing that, when I do this act of plotting to kill Hitler, I shouldn't do it, but I'm going to, and I'm going to be guilty of that? Was that the ethic that he had? Or did he have a whole transformation in his theology and ideology at the end and embrace realism in full? So we've got those three options that lie before us. Most people at the moment take that last option. It was an ideological shift. It wasn't just a misstep, him being inconsistent with his own theology. It was a complete transformation. Now, Dr. Mark Nation's book was the first time that I came across someone who actually argued for the first option, that Bonhoeffer maintained his pacifism to the end. And honestly, when I first saw that, it seemed like an extreme claim. One that it's sort of like a conspiracy theory, like, well, he really was a pacifist and they're making him look bad. And I was extremely skeptical of that case. And part of that skepticism was because I didn't feel like I really needed to argue it. I didn't feel like, I didn't recognize the ideological shift argument. And so for me, I'm like, you know what? He slipped up. What's the big deal? But once I read Dr. Nation's book and I heard the evidence, it's actually become, in my mind, more likely that Bonhoeffer did maintain his pacifism to the end. Now, I know that I'm biased, of course, at this point, so definitely check me on the information that I present and the information that Dr. Nation writes about. But as I sifted through the evidence, it really seemed more and more that the idea of Bonhoeffer as a committed assassin was really based on a limited case. Now, not necessarily a weak one. I don't want to straw man it, right? Because a substantial part of the evidence for Bonhoeffer being an assassin or plotting to kill Hitler, it was based on the testimony of a very close friends to him, Eberhard Bethge. And the fact that Bonhoeffer hung out with plotters who did make plans to kill Hitler, those are two pieces of very strong evidence, right? But when you start to look at the timeline of the assassination attempts and the plurality of testimonies from all of his close friends, not just one or two, I think that the balance, at least in my opinion, it tips towards Bonhoeffer's maintaining a pacifist stance. Now, I would say what probably solidified this conclusion for me in the past few months, so pretty recently, has been learning more about the story of, and I might pronounce his name wrong here, Helmut von Moltke. So von Moltke, he ran in the same circles as Bonhoeffer, the Kreisau group. There were a wide variety of ideologies held within that group, with some pacifists, some who embraced violence, some who were actually anti-Semitic, though not murderously so. They thought the Nazi regime took it too far. They just wanted some minor limitations on the Jews and like the positions that they could hold in office or whatnot. So, and the list goes on with just ideological differences within this group. But they were united on the important thing, like Hitler and his murderous regime were not good. Now, of course, we don't say that Bonhoeffer was anti-Semitic just because some people in that group were. So why claim that he embraced violence just because some in the group did? But Moltke, the reason his story is important is because more clearly than probably anybody else in the group, it's really clear that he did not support violence, a violent overthrow of Hitler, and that his early imprisonment, he said, was essentially a godsend in that it, number one, prevented him from having to choose to not do violence, and number two, to prevent his name from being mistakenly associated with violence, right? Guilty by association. Had he not been arrested as early as he was, and there was violence done towards Hitler, then he very easily could have been associated with that and his reputation tarnished because he did not want to participate in violence against Hitler, at least. Now, von Moltke, he had a much larger footprint than Bonhoeffer in terms of the number of people that he was able to help and what he was able to do to help the Jews across Axis-controlled territory. And yet, very few know von Moltke's name. Now, I think his story is a really important one to know because he provides a framework for understanding how Bonhoeffer could have clung to his pacifism while collaborating with those who were willing to do violence. And Dr. Nation talks a bit about that in his book. Like von Moltke, Bonhoeffer may have been seeking to participate in reaching out to his numerous contacts abroad, preparing a way for Germany's peace when Hitler fell, right? Not actively engaging in the plot to kill Hitler, but saying, hey, if these guys are going to plot to kill him, I want to make sure that we have a peace at the end, and I want to make sure that we're in contact with Britain and all these other people who can help to make that possible. And like von Moltke, Bonhoeffer may have clung to his convictions that violence was not the answer to the Hitler problem, while also being involved in planning with those who did. Now, since first recording this episode a number of years ago, there is also one other piece of evidence that has become strong in my mind that I didn't grab onto, that you're not going to get in this replay. Bonhoeffer was certainly not arrested for a conspiracy to kill Hitler, as court documents show. But I think this has become even more clear when you recognize that he spent 2 years in prison before his execution. Now, when you look at all those who were even somewhat remotely associated with assassination attempts against Hitler, they were killed really quickly after their arrest. I mean, just go look at the purges after, the Valkyrie guy. I can't think of it. Von Stauffenberg. I don't remember his name, but look at all the people who were killed. Lots and lots of people, and they're killed pretty quickly. And every once in a while, you'll find somebody who was left alive for a couple months, but they were usually only left alive and tortured that whole time to try to obtain information. And once that information, they thought they had exhausted the person, they just they killed him. Right? But Bonhoeffer, he didn't experience that daily severe torture, and he did not, and he was in prison for 2 years. He was in prison for a really long time. So that seems really odd that he would be in there for plotting to assassinate Hitler. And also, you see that the timing of his execution came after the discovery of Admiral Canaris of the Abwehr, which, when they discovered his diary, they realized that, man, the Abwehr, they've got loads of spies in them. They're an organization that you can't trust, and they just killed most or all of the Abwehr agents that were imprisoned at that point. They're like, we just need to get rid of them all. And so Hitler cleaned house. Just because Bonhoeffer was executed doesn't mean that they discovered something about his attempted assassination on Hitler. So Bonhoeffer's death seems to me, at least, almost certainly not a result of a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't engage in that and they just didn't discover it. But that piece of evidence of his arrest that a lot of people like to say, well, he must have done something severely wrong if he was arrested and executed for it. It just doesn't fly when you look at all of the other executions of people who weren't involved in that kind of stuff, and just because they were associated with the Abwehr or other sorts of groups. Hitler was just cleaning house. So if you take all those points in mind, von Moltke as a framework for understanding how Bonhoeffer, just because of his association, was not guilty or should not be guilty by association, I think that's helpful. And understanding Bonhoeffer's long imprisonment is also helpful evidence. In the rest of this episode, which is a replay from Season 2 on consequentialism, you are going to get the first part of Dr. Nation's case. I'm going to go through, in this episode, I'm going to explore the circumstantial and historical evidence that helps to vindicate Bonhoeffer. And in the next episode, we're going to look at the continuity of Bonhoeffer's theology to make an ideological case for his maintenance of pacifism. Hopefully, these episodes are going to help you think more deeply about the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the way that we so often accept simple narratives rather than embracing complexity. And just one other thing to note before you get into this, this is an episode from my early days of podcasting, so prepare your ears for a slightly different quality of sound. Hopefully that doesn't distract you too much and you're able to get through it to get the information that I think is really important when you consider the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Welcome back to the Fourth Way podcast. Today's episode is part 1 of a special edition, which is about the man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Since Bonhoeffer was executed on April 9th, 1945, and this April 9th, 2020, will mark the 75th anniversary of his execution, I thought that it would be a fitting episode to dedicate to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So many of you probably know that the name Bonhoeffer. He is famous as the pacifist who turned assassin in order to confront one of the greatest evils of our age, Hitler and the Nazi regime. Due to his rebellion, Bonhoeffer was executed by the regime shortly before liberation of the extermination camps in Germany and the defeat of Nazi Germany. In a book that I just read, Stanley Hauerwas wrote the foreword, and Hauerwas talks about how Bonhoeffer, as one of the most famous pacifists, or former pacifists, as many would see it, is often the first issue brought up to him when he talks about pacifism. People will say, yeah, well, what about Bonhoeffer? And to the majority of people, Bonhoeffer represents a hero in his wake-up call to reality and his renunciation of idealistic pacifism. They see Bonhoeffer as being just, in theory, a pacifist, but then when he's faced with a great evil like Hitler, he chooses to actually do something about it. And that's the way Bonhoeffer's viewed. I always accepted that narrative of Bonhoeffer's life, even after I became a pacifist. To me, the story was interesting, but Bonhoeffer's actions just seemed irrelevant to a logical case. The way that I saw it was that it's kind of like monogamy being proven false by Christian leaders who have affairs, or getting a divorce, even though those things might go against their ideology and convictions. They do it anyway. They perform those sins, and we wouldn't say that disproves the Bible's teaching of monogamy just because they fail at it. Now that's how I used to see it. Now, who cares if Bonhoeffer failed to live perfectly? But after this is actually my second go through of this episode, because I sent it off to one of the authors of the book that I just read on Bonhoeffer, entitled Bonhoeffer the Assassin, and he critiqued this aspect by saying that, well, actually it's a little bit more significant than that. And so he's with the anti-pacifists here, where he said, the problem with Bonhoeffer is, if somebody has an affair, if a pastor has an affair, he wouldn't say that he changed his moral ethic, his belief about whether or not having an affair was good or not. He just failed at the standard. However, what people are arguing here with Bonhoeffer is that Bonhoeffer did not merely compromise the ethic, but his theology changed. So he actually thought that doing violence was good. That's the way that it's generally portrayed. So this is not a moral compromise, this is an ideological shift, and that's a bit more significant. Now we could still argue and discuss, well, he shifted his ideology because he felt like he needed to justify himself. He was a weak pacifist, and so he said he changed his ideology, but he just did that in order to be able to do this action. And people do that all the time with sins. People might have a conviction about pornography, and then justify it like, well, this is better than going out and actually having sex, or this is to help me calm my urges so I don't do something worse, or whatever the excuse is and whatever the sin is. People justify themselves in the moment when they want to do something. Another way that you could look at what Bonhoeffer did, instead of self-justification, you could make a case that Bonhoeffer thought he was doing something wrong, but did it anyway. Parents do this with kids sometimes. Parents will say, I know I shouldn't lie to my kids, but and then fill in the excuse, right? You find that there's maybe some greater good that you want to uphold, even though you know you shouldn't do an evil to accomplish that. So one could make the case that maybe that's what Bonhoeffer did. But that's not the case that these authors are going to make. These authors are going to say that Bonhoeffer's life was actually, once he converted to pacifism, it was lived out in a pacifist manner. Now, consequentialists aren't going to like this. They are going to argue that Bonhoeffer changed his idealism. They want to co-opt Bonhoeffer really badly because consequentialists view pacifism as idealistic. They think Bonhoeffer's life shows how real trials and reality change people's minds in the face of great evil. And Bonhoeffer is their case in point. So they like him. But in this new book called it's not really new, it's from 2013. But in this book entitled Bonhoeffer the Assassin, the authors are going to argue that Bonhoeffer maintained his pacifism, and they use both historical reasons for this as well as internal reasons from Bonhoeffer's own writings. And that's one thing I've found particularly good about this book, is that it's a holistic case. They try to get inside Bonhoeffer's head by showing his explicit writings and what he said, but they also show historical detail to show why it seems unreasonable to believe that Bonhoeffer could actually have made an assassination attempt on Hitler. So this case will be laid out in two parts. The first part will be external evidence, like historical facts and such, and the second part will be, I'll label, internal evidence, which will be from Bonhoeffer's writings mostly. So let's take a look at the external evidence. Bonhoeffer had a major ideological transformation between 1929 and 1931. In 1929, Bonhoeffer gave a lecture in Barcelona which justified murder, particularly murder for the state, as well as some other, he discussed some other conundrums, moral conundrums. But at some point in the years between 1929 and 31, Bonhoeffer made a very big transition and actually began to identify as a pacifist. And he actually explicitly identified as a pacifist. He called himself that. Bonhoeffer began to push back against the Nazis and support the oppressed people while he was a pacifist. Interestingly, the majority of the church in Germany who weren't pacifists sided with Hitler and the war machine. But Bonhoeffer, the pacifist, who, supposedly pacifism is passive, he actually was one of the few voices pushing back against the Nazi regime, getting himself into trouble, being called an enemy of the state and all that. A little bit later, Bonhoeffer even created a community where he discipled leaders and taught explicitly pacifism and advocated conscientious objection, being a conscientious objector. This is the community from which the book Life Together came out. And you have to recognize that advocating being a conscientious objector was a really big deal back then, because if you said, I'm not going to join the army, it's not like you just had you were just looked down upon. You were executed. It's an executable offense. Bonhoeffer, recognizing that he was going to get drafted most likely, ended up joining the German intelligence agency through the close contacts that he had, in order, we believe, to avoid conscription. Because if he joined the German intelligence agency, he did not have to go and fight. So evidence seems to indicate that Bonhoeffer did not do this to get at Hitler, but actually he did this in order to avoid conscription. And we'll come back to some of the evidence that shows that in a little bit. During his time in the German intelligence agency, Bonhoeffer helped a number of Jews to flee. He used his position to help Jews escape Germany. Because the intelligence agency was kind of a known hotbed of spies and such. At one point, the Germans began to look really closely and sift through documents and watch what was going on, and they discovered Bonhoeffer's helping of the Jews to flee and some missing money and such that he was able to use to help that happen. And so Bonhoeffer was explicitly convicted for avoiding military service and helping others to do the same. That's what he was charged with. And the irony is that if you do believe that Bonhoeffer remained a pacifist, that he ended up being killed for his moral consistency, yet today we praise him for the opposite. We praise him for his moral inconsistency and changing his position on the topic. During Bonhoeffer's time in the German intelligence, or closely tied to it, there are only 5 assassination attempts which would be reasonable to assume Bonhoeffer could have been a part of. There were 2 attempts done before Bonhoeffer joined the German intelligence, and we think that he knew of, or at least had a strong possibility of knowing of, most of, if not all of these attempts, because of his close connection with some family who was in the intelligence agency who were parts of the plots. So there were 2 plots before Bonhoeffer joined the German intelligence, and even though maybe he knew about those, it doesn't seem like he would have really been able to have much of a hand in them because he didn't have a position where he could help. There were 2 attempts on Hitler's life connected to Bonhoeffer's agency, an agency of 12,000 workers here. So there were plenty of other people who were spies and such. I think they estimate around 50. But there were 2 attempts on Hitler's life while Bonhoeffer was at the agency, but both of those fell through and were not discovered. In one of them, an individual replaced some bottles of wine that were going to be transported on Hitler's plane. He replaced those with explosives, but for whatever reason, the fuse did not go off. And so when the plane landed, the guy quickly figured out how to get the bombs out and replace it with wine, and it was not discovered. There's another one where Hitler was getting a tour of some place, and the guy giving the tour had a suicide bomb vest on. Well, something came up, and Hitler left like 2 minutes into the 10-minute tour, and the guy quickly went to the bathroom and defused the vest. So no German army official or anybody found out about those 2 attempts, and so nobody was arrested for that. Nobody found that out, so Bonhoeffer definitely was not charged with or arrested or executed for those 2 attempts. And then the last attempt would have been one that transpired after Bonhoeffer's arrest, and that is the incident that the movie Valkyrie is with Tom Cruise is famous for. So there were 2 that happened like way back in 1939 before Bonhoeffer joined the German intelligence, 2 that were never discovered while Bonhoeffer was in the German intelligence, and one which happened after Bonhoeffer was arrested and put in jail. So it really seems like you cannot link Bonhoeffer's execution to any of those assassination attempts on Hitler, because there was no opportunity there, but also because Bonhoeffer's explicit charges were that he was subverting the government. Subverting the government by avoiding conscription and by helping others to avoid Germany as well. Now, he did have very close relationships with some of the conspirators, and we also know that he was using his influence to seek guaranteed peace. So we know that because Bonhoeffer was out of the country and he had close connections with the United States and Britain and some other countries, and Karl Barth in, where was he, Sweden, maybe? We know that Bonhoeffer had connections elsewhere, and that he was trying to use those to guarantee peace. So he was saying, hey, look, people are trying to take Hitler down. if Hitler goes down, can we have an understood guarantee for peace? Because we don't want people to come in here and take advantage of us, etc. So what we do know of Bonhoeffer's involvement was that he was working on the peace aspect. We have no evidence of Bonhoeffer condoning, planning, or participating in violence whatsoever. No charges from the government. We have no, just nothing that would nail Bonhoeffer down to having participated in or approved of violence. Now, we don't really know Bonhoeffer's conversations with all of the conspirators, but we do have a framework for what that might have looked like. One of Bonhoeffer's former students talks about how he felt so ashamed when he came back from the front and he talked with Bonhoeffer, because Bonhoeffer knew the terrible things that they had to do or that were done, because his students wrote him letters about what was going on, executing civilians and such. And this guy he could barely look Bonhoeffer in the eyes. But he said that Bonhoeffer was gracious to him in his context. He talked to him, asked him how he was doing, didn't condemn, and just loved him and met him where he was at, even though the student knew Bonhoeffer's convictions. So we can imagine that it may have been somewhat the same. While Bonhoeffer is working with these other people who are good, who have different convictions about and are in a different situation and are seeking to undermine Hitler and this evil regime, Bonhoeffer in his conversation may have held his convictions and met them where they were at. He may have not approved of what they were doing, or may have said, I'm not going to do that myself, but I do want to work peace, and he went and worked within his context of conviction. Now, some people might say that is a compromised position, and his refusal to out those individuals who are seeking the death of Hitler, maybe that makes him culpable, and maybe it does. But if Bonhoeffer was trying to do the best that he knew how in a very difficult situation, and the most you can pin on him is that he didn't tell on people he knew were plotting Hitler's death. I mean, it's hard to argue that he then threw off his ideal of pacifism. Maybe you would say that he was an imperfect pacifist, but to argue that his whole ideal shifted is just not something that you're going to be able to do from the evidence. Let's go ahead and take a look at the internal evidence then. The majority of the book is actually dedicated to this aspect and goes very deep, and I'm just going to scratch the surface. Bonhoeffer considered that he had a true conversion when he fully saw and embraced Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, sometime post-1929. So Bonhoeffer said he really only became a Christian, he converted, after he was already a pastor, after 1929, when he truly saw Christ. After his conversion, he began to label himself as a pacifist explicitly, and taught against joining the army, advocated loving enemies. He subverted German injustices. He railed against the church's nationalism, and he himself avoided military service. In 1944, by his own admission, just a year or less before his death, he made the statement that I have held a consistent trajectory since my conversion. And that's what he said. He said that his trajectory has been consistent since his conversion. Now we can say, well, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean he's remained a Christian, or does that mean like his core beliefs? And that's what it seems to indicate, that his core beliefs have remained the same since his conversion. The place where people like to try to convict Bonhoeffer of his changing ideals is in what they argue is a shift from Bonhoeffer's idealism to more of a Nieberian realism. So, in one of Bonhoeffer's last works that wasn't completed, he emphasizes his disdain for absolutism, and this disdain for absolutes seems to many, to be indicative of his acceptance of Niebuhr's realism. And this idea that we live in a fallen world, we just kind of have to do what we have to do, and so therefore don't throw these absolutes in my face. But what people fail to understand is that Bonhoeffer was not throwing off objective morality and pacifism, but rather he was talking about the grounding of those things. And the grounding of those things, rather than being in some list that is absolute, is found in an individual who is absolutely real. So Bonhoeffer grounded morality not in some objective standard of laws outside of God, but he grounded them in God himself in the person of Jesus Christ. Absolute ideals produce legalism and don't require grace to complete. But being in a relationship with Christ and being like him requires grace and produces community and life. You can be a moralistic pacifist who hates enemies and condemns former students who join the army, all while not harming other people, right? If Bonhoeffer was a moralistic pacifist who based absolutes on just this list of things, then Bonhoeffer could have been a pacifist that didn't harm people while hating enemies and judging his students and not meeting them where they were at. Or, like Bonhoeffer did, you can be a declared pacifist because you follow Jesus Christ, whose pacifism isn't just some ideal outside of himself, but is a fruit of walking with Jesus Christ. And that's what Bonhoeffer was doing. He wasn't saying there aren't things that are absolutely true and absolutely moral. He's saying that Jesus Christ is the absolute, and whatever is like him, whatever is relationally with him, is what's good. And Bonhoeffer would say that harming other people, doing violence to other people, is something that does not look like Christ. Unfortunately, this talk of absolutes and a disdain for it makes people say, well, Bonhoeffer was just a realist who recognizes, like his 1929 self, that there are all these moral conundrums and we can't know morality. It's not this absolute thing. But that's not what Bonhoeffer himself seems to indicate. The authors of the book spend much more time on this case than I have spent here. You should definitely check it out. I learned a lot about Bonhoeffer, Barth, Niebuhr, history, ethics, Germany, and a lot more. And the point is that you really can't get Bonhoeffer the assassin from the evidence. It's not something that sticks out so clearly, yet everybody seems to be so sure of it. It might be true, maybe, but the evidence seems to indicate that it's very unlikely. It seems to me that the surety we have of Bonhoeffer the assassin, of that narrative, shows us more our preconceived ideas than truth. We want to self-justify our violence and our refusal to recognize nonviolent action as being Christ-like. And so Bonhoeffer is a nice notch in our belts to help us feel better about continuing in that ideology. Bonhoeffer is a hero for failing to assassinate Hitler violently because he held to his convictions, and he was one of the only people who spoke out because he recognized that truth, right, the sword from our mouths and our testimony, is what Christ calls us to. Unfortunately, Bonhoeffer is rarely recognized for helping Jews, for creating community, for discipling young people, and for being a voice in the darkness. It's just really sad to me that we feel the need for Bonhoeffer to be violent for us to elevate him. I hope you take a deeper look at Bonhoeffer's life, and coming directly from a friend who studied at Bonhoeffer's place over in Germany, and talked with a lot of the Germans who were there and who are experts on him, they said, whatever you do, don't read Metaxas's version of Bonhoeffer because it's just so bad. But that's the only one anyone knows. So make sure you do some research and figure out some good sources to get. In part 2, I am going to explore some of the authors and Bonhoeffer's specific ideas that stood out to me in relation to our topic of consequentialism. And I want to pull those out and expound on them and show you a little bit more about Bonhoeffer and his ideology and how that impacts our lives. That's all for now. So peace. And since I'm a pacifist, and I say it, I mean it.